Today, I'm going to talk about the problem with rhetorical arguments and the relationship to accusations of strawmen. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. So to start off, I'm going to describe what I mean by a rhetorical argument. And because it's not like a rhetorical question, it's an argument that is phrased using rhetoric, and I mean one that's phrased using rhetoric but not logic. So I'll explain what rhetoric is. First off, rhetoric is, if you're not familiar, it's the art of how to make a point easy to understand or easy to accept. So this is a tool. It is a neutral, like most tools, it is neutral. It is morally neutral. It can be used either to make the truth easy to accept or to make a falsehood easy to accept. And whether it's good or bad depends upon how it is used. The art of rhetoric was, in classical education, one of the things, in addition to like theology and philosophy and logic that people, in mathematics, that people would study, they'd also study rhetoric. And so it's very useful. It is, in general, an act of, generosity, really, to spend the effort and time to develop one's rhetoric, to present the truth, to present a good argument rhetorically effectively, so that it is both logically sound as well as rhetorically easy to accept the soundness and the truth being presented. Now, to give an example, take Teddy Roosevelt's classic, "Walk softly and carry a big stick and you will go far." Now, this is a very rhetorically skillful way of putting, essentially, if you're to translate it out just sort of into a bare, dry sort of logic, something to the effect of, if you deal with people in a manner that is not provocative, but have the ability to use force such that you cannot be overcome and make it clear that you have this force, you will not often be impeded. Means the same thing, but it just doesn't sound nearly as good. And now I want to get into why not, because this is going to be important when I talk about the relationship of rhetorical arguments to accusations of strawmen. So why does it not sound as good? Well, this is because the rhetoric is, if you look at it, it's essentially a collection of micro-narratives. Well, it's not one, in some sense it's one general narrative, but it's really three micro-narratives. If you look at this particular one, there's speak softly is one micro-narrative. Now, speaking softly has a lot of implications to it. It conjures up the image of a person who's speaking softly, but when you think of a person who speaks softly, there are different ways that you think of speaking softly, but they all amount to being inoffensive in one way or another, to not being a threat, to not trying to bully people, to appeal to people's intellect rather than to their emotions, and at least not to the emotion of fear, which will tend to make them aggressive and defensive and so on. Now, but that can go in a variety of ways. You can speak softly out of being gentle, or you can speak softly out of being timid. So now we come to the second micro-narrative, and carry a big stick. Now, there are two things to carrying a big stick, actually, if you think about it. One of them is that you have a great deal of the ability to use force. The other of them, in addition to being able to use force, is if you are carrying a big stick, everyone is going to see it. You can't carry a big stick hidden, because it's big. So there are two components to carrying the big stick within this. One of those components is that you have the ability to use a great deal of force. And the second is that everybody knows it. So that your speaking softly will be interpreted as being gentle, not as being timid. People will not sense weakness here. They will not be tempted to use force to overcome you, but much more inclined to actually negotiate with you. And then that last part, and you will go far. Going far means that you are progressing along on a goal that you have without it being interrupted, without it being subverted, without your progress being stopped, so that things will go according to your plans. You will go far. Really what it is it's one of the things that it's hinting at. Again, it's a micro-narrative. Now, why are micro-narratives so, this sort of micro-narrative, and it's put with, these three micro-narratives are related to each other within a bigger narrative. That if you have these two things that you do, then they will be related in a causal way to this third thing of long unimpeded progress. Now, why is it important that these things use micro-narratives and then can put them together into a sort of larger narrative? The larger narrative is not as important as the micro-narratives, by the way, for rhetoric. Understanding what rhetoric is, it's sort of like a base level. And the answer is, it's because reality is fundamentally a narrative. That's why narrative structure is so convincing. That's why narrative structure is so powerful. And it's why human thought tends to be narrative, because that's really what reality is. Look in the beginning of the book of Genesis. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And, so it progresses. The world is actually the unfolding of events according to a rational plan that are created in that fashion. The world is a story, and God is its author. This is really the fundamental structure of reality, and that is why it is so appealing to us. Pardon. In the Enlightenment, there's this idea that abstract thought is the highest form of rationality, but that's not at all the case. What it is, it's a trade-off. Abstraction is a trade-off. It's like a tool. It's actually very analogous in the way to how a sword is a trade-off. Abstraction is, if you look at what the thing actually is, it's taking one small element from something and leaving the rest behind. You are abstracting, taking from the thing. So in the same way that a sword is powerful because it concentrates all of your force into a very, very, very small place. And so when you swing with a sword, it is powerful precisely because all of the power that you have is being concentrated into a very, very, very narrow area. And so it's not that you have more force, but rather that force is being applied in a very, very specific way. Abstraction lets you do the same thing. Abstraction lets you put all of your mental faculties into a very, very narrow area. So that when you look at the Pythagorean theorem, right? If you have 3 points, which are things with no extension, so they don't really exist at all. They can't exist, right? So we've already abstracted so far away that this cannot possibly exist. We're having one property, and that is nothing but location without any form of extension. Nothing has that property. And then you have these 3 lines connecting these points. These things have extension in only one dimension. And so that you have these things, which again, you can't actually have things like that. If you have this thing, then the sum of the squares of the lengths of the 2 sides is equal to the square of the length of the other side. So you can see this relationship very clearly by abstracting it, that they have exactly this property. And by not considering the myriad of things that would be true of any real thing, but rather abstracting away just the specific sort of location information, you are able to think about that very, 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 very narrow aspect of it far more clearly. Now, the problem with that, and the reason why this is powerful, especially there are certain fields, like engineering in particular, where this is very powerful because things like will the bridge fall is made up largely, there's metallurgy that goes into it, so you have to make the steel right. But if you make the steel right, it's largely about some very simple properties like how thick is the thing and how much weight is on top of it and how long is it unsupported and so on. And so there are only a few properties that really govern whether the bridge will support the loads you're going to put on it or not. And so this abstraction is a very powerful tool, like a sword. But it is in no way the highest form of this. It does allow you certain kinds of control over the world, but very, very narrow kinds of control over the world. Narrative is far and away the much more powerful, much more real, much more fundamental one, because narrative references things, and then references not just things on their own, but things through time, which is really it's an exaggeration to say the fullness of their being, which is what I want to say, or the easy thing to say. It's not the fullness of their being, but it's much more of the fullness of their being as you look through them through time, because in one exact femtosecond, one exact moment, a live human being and a corpse, fresh corpse, are basically identical. It's over time that the live human being and the corpse are really very, very radically different things. And so narrative is over time. Narrative it captures the majority of being. So that's why narrative is so powerful. And that's why rhetoric is mostly, not 100% exclusively, but mostly using the art of micro-narratives in order to supply the structures of reality in a very intelligible way, because we are oriented towards understanding reality in its fullness, not in its narrowness. And so when we present the fullness of things, or at least, part of the fullness of things, our minds have a much easier time latching on to this stuff. That is to say, when you present it in micro-narrative structure, the mind has a much easier time accepting it, because that's the sort of thing the mind is supposed to actually deal with. Abstraction is really not what the mind was made for, though it is possible. It's just a tool. It is not what it's, the meat it's really supposed to be feeding on. It's like a vitamin pill, a little bit. It's a little bit of it is kind of helpful, but if you tried to live on it, you'd get absolutely nowhere. Now, you'd starve to death in that analogy. So now we're coming just about to the crux of the matter. So the thing about these is that you can use rhetoric to make acceptable to the mind listening a thing which is in no way actually true, where it does not logically hold together. So I'm going to give an example of this, show how that's the case, and then once we have that, we've got the final piece necessary in order to show the relationship of this to accusations of strawmen. So I'm going to use that thing about can God create a rock so big that God can't lift it? Now, if you look at what's going on, you have essentially the micro-narratives of God creating a rock so big it can't be lifted. Oh, I'm sorry. The way that thing tends to then follow is, no, then God is not omnipotent. Okay. And then you have God can't, therefore not omnipotent, as sort of, in this case, a third micro-narrative. Rhetoric does not break everything down into micro-narratives. That just tends to be, simple stuff frequently comes in thirds, because you have two things that relate and produce a conclusion. So that you will see that structure frequently in very small things. That's not by any means universal. Okay, so the problem with this is these things in no way relate to each other. There's no logical coherence to this whatsoever, for the simple reason that there is no such thing as a rock so big that unlimited force can't move it. It's not a thing. Those words in that order do not refer to anything. Words are symbols, and their relationships to each other describe the relationships of the things. And if there exists nothing that can have these relationships, those words are nonsense. And a rock so big that no amount of force can move it can't possibly exist. I mean, if you know any physics, this is really super ludicrously obvious, for the simple reason that a speck of dust flying exerts gravitational attraction on every body throughout the entire universe. And yes, I know that physicists in general will neglect it because it's too hard to compute. But if you're not being lazy in the standard manner, you know that there is some non-zero amount of force that's applied. And when you apply force to mass, you get motion. It will be incredibly small amounts of motion, but still motion, and the original thing said, so big you can't move it. Now, what probably is in mind, and what that sort of micro-narrative will actually tend to conjure, is a human being unable to push a rock off of the earth, in which case what you're actually talking about is not moving it, but moving it within a gravitational field away from the center of attraction of that gravitational field. So that's sometimes it's so big you can't move it, so big you can't lift it, etc. There are slight variations on this, but again, there is no such thing. Since any rock, by being a rock, is a finite thing, there is, and it's not very hard to solve for, some amount of force that will then produce acceleration away from its local gravitational attraction. There cannot be, in principle, a rock so big that it is impossible to lift. Can't be. This is nonsense. And so the problem is this micro-narrative is really referencing human beings. It's referencing the fact that by having muscles and bones and tendons and whatnot, there is a limit to how big those things can scale. There is such thing as a rock so big that nothing with a vertebrate body plan could lift it off the ground. Simply because the way we are built does not scale to infinite force production. So you get bigger and bigger, it simply won't work. it's using that. It's using people, not God. It is not really considering the thing, but because it's a micro-narrative, it's referencing this. And if you're not really paying attention, you can easily not notice that what's being talked about implicitly is human beings, not God. Now, so that's why, so this is nonsensical to say that can God do this thing? No. Can God do, and then you don't actually fill it in, is more properly the case. Because if you use a bunch of words that do not refer to anything, they are in a literal sense nonsense. And so this is equivalent to, can God, that's not a thing. That's not, you haven't said anything. You haven't finished your sentence. You've just made some noise after starting a sentence. Now, to go from, I have just spouted some nonsense, to concluding anything whatsoever is, of course, logically invalid, because logic does require premises. You can't just spout noise and then pretend you have a premise. Very logically invalid. However, here's the thing. And here we're coming to the crux of what I want to talk about. The person to whom this is appealing is not going to be impressed by this, because he never looked at the logical structure, because there is no logical structure to this. I mean, it's literally nonsense, therefore conclusion. You can substitute for nonsense blank sound, therefore conclusion. That's not a logical structure. There is no logical structure here. It's not even an invalid logical structure. It's just straight up invalid. It's just straight up no logical structure. So the person who was convinced by this never was convinced by the logical structure of it, didn't make any sort of mistake of that kind. What happened was that he was essentially seduced by the micro-narratives. And the micro-narratives put together in this structure were very vivid to him. He could picture them. And since he never thought about it, he did this sort of narrative thinking or rhetorical thinking, where the rhetoric alone is what convinced him. He had a sequence of vivid images in his mind. A vivid image being a rock, a really, really big rock. But if you're strong enough to lift the biggest rock, because that's something a human being could do. There could be a biggest rock around nearby, and if you're strong enough to lift the biggest rock, then there's no such thing as a rock so big you can't lift it. But if you can't lift it, then you're not strong enough, and there has to be one of those two things. So obviously you can't have both, and that's somewhat true of people. But it wasn't people that we're actually talking about. But the narrative structure, he had a sequence of vivid images in his mind, and so he likes the conclusion because he had, sort of this sequence of vivid images, vivid mental images. Narrative images, not like static two-dimensional things, but sort of not quite movie clips in a literal sense, but in a sort of metaphorical sense. A few of these things, and they were very vivid, and he saw them clearly, and that's it. He never really thought it through. Now, here's the thing. When you give him the logical argument, show that this is nonsense, and it doesn't work. If he will think logically, then okay, fine, you're done. Because he'll see that it's not logically coherent. But the problem is, if you tell him, this one is actually not the best example for this aspect of it, but if you were to essentially tell him, can this man blah, 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 no, then this man therefore can't play tennis. And you say this has the exact same logical structure as what you had, he'll call that a straw man. Now, it's a little bit, this will be clearer, and it's unfortunate. I'll try to use a different example in a minute. It's a little unfortunate that I picked this example for this aspect of it, for the simple reason that if there was at least an invalid logical structure, that would help. So I'll present that in a moment. But what will happen is that he will not recognize his argument in what you are saying, even though it's got the same logical structure as what he said, because it doesn't have the same rhetoric as what he said. I'll get to that again in a moment, but hopefully it's clear why. I want to point out, too, that this is why it's especially helpful if someone is presenting you with rhetorical arguments, not to give them logical arguments a solely logical argument. You always want your arguments to logically hold together. So there's no exception to that. You always want logical arguments in that sense. But you sometimes want purely logical arguments. Sometimes what you want is rhetorically logical arguments. Now, for example, you can show a person that's the same thing as asking, can an author write anything he wants to in his book? And the answer is obviously yes. And then saying, can the author write into his book a rock so large that he cannot write into his book that the rock moved? Well, no, because obviously you can always do that. He can't write anything he wants into his book then. No, that's not what any of those words mean. And if you present it in that fashion, what you're doing is you're presenting a counter-narrative. Now, he may or may not accept it, but by presenting a counter-narrative, if he is willing to entertain it and if he can see it, it will then challenge the narrative that he already has. He will try to wrestle with how these two things are different and won't really come up with it, but it will tend to require him to think because he has been challenged by some vivid mental images again. And so the vividness of the mental images in the one is sort of being cancelled out by the vividness of the mental images in the counter-argument, allowing him to then consider the logical aspect of these things, the actual relationships involved. Now, to give I don't know a rhetorical version of it easily, but to just show, like the basic thing you do with logical arguments and dry logical arguments would be like, if Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is a man. Now, it's not very rhetorical. It's pretty darn logically dry. So, you can embellish it slightly. Like, all men are mortal. Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is a man. Or being mortal is what makes the man. Now, the thing is, if you then present the same argument that is, again, has valid premises but a false conclusion, to show the logical structure can lead to false conclusions, does not guarantee true conclusions, you could then pick up with, like, if Socrates is a bullfrog, then Socrates is mortal. Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is a bullfrog. Identical logical structure, true premises in both cases, true conclusion in the one, false conclusion in the other. Now, a person who can think logically will see, that is not a good argument because it can lead you from true premises to a false conclusion. Okay, there's a problem here. Let me go back and think on this. That's if a person can think logically. And unfortunately, I don't know a really good rhetorical way of going from Socrates is mortal to Socrates is a man. But the thing is, if you can stretch your imagination, and forgive me for not having a good example here, if a person found a really good rhetorical argument going for saying that Socrates is a man because Socrates is mortal, what you would, if you then presented the bullfrog argument in that simple logical form, it had the same logical content as what I just did, but it had none of the rhetoric. What would happen is the man who didn't think about the logic but only thought about the rhetoric would say, that's a straw man. I'm not talking about bullfrogs. I'm talking about men. And something like that. And the reason why he's going to do this is because the thing that you're setting up that has the same logical structure that shows that the underlying logic is invalid is going to lack everything that convinced him. It's going to look nothing like what convinced him because it's not going to have any of the particular micro-narratives that he found so appealing, that he found so informative, that were so vivid to him. And because of this, because your logical rendition of it showing that the logic isn't valid will have none of the vivid micro-narrative structures in it, he will not recognize what he was saying in what you're saying. Because the only thing that actually was present to his mind is the vivid micro-narratives. As a result, what happens when you see a person who was convinced by a rhetorical but not logical argument of something, and you try to show him that the logic he is using is not valid logic by taking the same logic, doing what you should do with logic, taking the same logic, stripping it of all rhetoric, Looking at the logical structure, then looking at that logical structure in a place where you have known true premises and a known false conclusion, and showing, therefore, this logic is not valid. It does not necessarily lead from true premises to a true conclusion. What's going to happen is he's going to accuse you of making straw men. You're just, defeating straw man. You just built up a straw man to knock down. And he's wrong. You did not build a straw man. You actually attacked the logical argument that was there. But he won't know it. He won't know it because he never noticed what the logical argument was to begin with. He only ever noticed the rhetoric. And your rendition, entirely logically correct, doesn't have any of that rhetoric. And therefore, because you're not attacking the rhetoric, you're only attacking the logic, and it was the rhetoric that actually appealed to him, he is, in some strange sense, correct that you are not, in fact, attacking his argument, such as it was. That's not your fault. You're attacking the actual important part. You're not attacking the fluff, but he is correct that you're not attacking the fluff. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, and sort of the practical takeaway from all this, aside from recognizing these things, that the person is not being a complete idiot when he identifies the exact logical equivalent argument, you attacking his actual argument, the actual logical structure of his argument as a straw man. He's noting, he's telling you that you are not doing anything to help him see the truth. So while he's incorrect about what he's saying, he has misidentified what the problem is, he is correct and he is giving you the useful information that you're not doing anything helpful. You're being logical when what he needs is something rhetorical. Because rhetoric is only really ever countered by other rhetoric. Rhetoric can be overcome by logic. It is true that a person who hears a very persuasive logical argument, but who will think logically, they're not overly likely to be persuaded by a logically invalid, rhetorically sound argument. I probably shouldn't use sound, but like a rhetorically skillful argument. But if they were, and you present them with a logical thing, they will be able to overcome the rhetoric with rational thinking. But for people who, for whatever reason, are having difficulty with that, the way to help them is not with the logical argument. It is, as I said, always make all your arguments logically sound. That needs to be given. But what you really need to do is try to find some rhetoric that can actually speak to the person, because it's rhetoric that will help him, and rhetoric will. It's not that your rhetoric will persuade him, but rather your rhetoric will cancel out his rhetoric, allowing him to think more clearly about the subject. For the most part, occasionally, if you have better rhetoric, it'll just win out. I have occasionally seen examples of that, but in any event, much more common is that the one rhetoric cancels out the other rhetoric and sort of lets the person actually do more, think a bit more clearly about the subject. So, like in the original example, if you use the example of the author, you're now presenting a very vivid example of how the person is just going very wrong in this micro-narrative, or in the micro-narratives that they have set up. So, that's the practical takeaway is, if a person is accusing you of making a straw man when you have exactly represented their logical argument, what they're probably actually telling you is that they were only ever persuaded by the rhetoric, not by the logic, and you haven't done anything to help them escape the strength of the rhetoric that they were persuaded by. And so it tells you how to proceed. It's so there is a utility to it. And also, it's, of course, very helpful not to be confused by it because you're not actually making a straw man. But it's one of those things. It's a little bit like getting editing advice. I don't know how many people have ever written stories. Or occasionally, it doesn't have to be fiction. Nonfiction, too. If you write a nonfiction piece, explaining something, and somebody gives you some sort of criticism of it, there's a sort of common wisdom that when a person is giving you advice on how to fix something, especially in your story, but also sometimes in nonfiction pieces, when it's not purely factual stuff, like, oh, you got this date wrong, not that stuff, that the advice is rarely correct, but the identification of where there's a problem is almost always correct. that that especially in, I mean, it applies more when you're writing a fiction story, that the way a person would suggest to fix your fiction story will almost never be from the same place that your fiction story is coming from, your head. It's very hard for them to put their head sort of where you are coming from in the writing of the story. So they almost never will suggest something that really is in the spirit of what you're trying to do, because they're not telepathic. But they will be very correct in identifying what sort of problem is here for at least some people, and often a lot of people. And so in the same sort of spirit, when you attack somebody's argument and have completely accurately represented the logic of it, I mean, and always double check that you've actually understood correctly. They're not using terms in some sort of weird way that you misunderstood their argument because they were using terms in a non-standard way or something like that. But once you've done your appropriate double checking, if someone accuses you of straw man and you have not in any way made a straw man, what's probably going on is that you are being purely logical without being rhetorical, or your rhetoric is not at a sufficient level to engage the rhetoric that actually persuaded them. And so that is the time to focus on your rhetoric and focus on improving your rhetoric in these cases, because what they're communicating is most likely that the thing that will help them here is not logic, but rhetoric that, not logic, but logic combined with rhetoric. So I hope that helps, and until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.